Thank you very much, Dr. Farooq. So for the first session, it's going to be on the history of Islamic political thought from classical to modern period, the first sessions. We have given the readings to all the participants already. And I hope that you've done all the readings because it's important for us to conduct the sessions with the readings already in mind. So without further ado, I'd like to pass the sessions to Professor James Picastori. Yes, please. The floor is yours.
Welcome to all. It's a great pleasure to be here again. And I hope I don't crash with jet lag any minute now, but I hope you'll be able to follow what I'm saying. Thank you. So you can do that. Okay, good. So as Dr. Farooq said, he's given me a huge topic. So, 1,400 years of thought. So this is going to be, I'm not going to do justice, and I'm sure you're going to think of many things that I haven't said. So please, this is where you come in with questions and comments, etc. And I do have probably too detailed a number of PowerPoints here, slides, and the presentation. So I'd like to make it available to you because there'll be more detail that I'm probably not going to say, but it would be, I think, maybe useful to you at some point to look at it. I guess what I really wanted to get across is some of the sort of the larger points about Islamic political thought. And maybe the largest point that I want to make, and I'll kind of repeat this at the end, is that I think that it has been a dialectical evolution between sort of principle and pragmatism. One of the ideas, I think, is sometimes that when we're talking about Islamic political thought, particularly in maybe its modern manifestation, we tend to freeze it and think of it as a set of theological prescriptions, whereas in fact these have probably changed over time, and there has been a kind of some evolution of thought, but in the direction of what pragmatism or necessity requires. So changing circumstances are always important when we're trying to understand what the thought is, whether it's political thought or just generally. Now, you've got one of the readings I know will take you through the chronological periods. So I'm not going to try to take us through the actual history and to break down Islamic history into certain stages. What I would like to do in this lecture and in the next one is to take what I think of as three important ideas. There could have been four, there could have been five, but just for the sake of the session, let's try to organize this one according to two big ideas, and they're essentially authority, the debates about authority, and the debates about renewal and reform. And again, sort of the larger point that I'll try to make throughout this is that there's going to be several different lines of thought. There's just not going to be one particular interpretation. There's an incredible richness throughout the Islamic heritage. And I wouldn't want us to minimize that sense of excitement that has occurred intellectually throughout the Islamic centuries. So on the first concept of authority, so just sort of general points, and these are the points that you would already know. I think that there obviously is a question about who should be the proper Islamic authority, and I'm going to say a little bit more in a moment about the caliphate. But I'd like to kind of maybe fix it in time for you a little bit and say that in some ways it seems to me that a consensus had occurred fairly early, by the time of the first Civil War, by the time of sort of between 656 and 661, the very beginning of Islam, and then it becomes, of course, further developed with the Umayyads. What was the point? The point was that there should be a leadership of the community after the Prophet that should be invested with religious legitimacy and with a sort of moral purpose and a moral mission. And essentially what I want to argue is that just about everybody would agree to that, though there were going to be many differences in interpretation. The two most important, of course, will be the Shia, and you know that this would argue that authority would go through the lineage of the direct lineage of the Prophet. We also know that the Kharijites, the Khawarij, argued that in fact that authority should really inhere in the community, and that any individual man, free man, would be able to exercise that on behalf of the community as long as that person was morally acceptable. But even with the Shia, even with the Khawarij, there was the acceptance of a kind of moral standard, that there ought to be a moral standard for leadership. That, however, causes a problem as the Islamic empires and dynasties expand. As Islam becomes more successful territorially, politically, as it expands, as it becomes multicultural, it has the need, as any social order would have, for stability. And therefore, this kind of almost idealized leadership, I think, becomes contested because of the necessity for stable leadership of a far-flung empire. So over time, then, the kind of question is, to what extent should the leadership encapsulate morality, or was maybe putting it differently, is the leader of the community to be a political office, a religious office, as well as a political office? And kind of running through the centuries now, here's, I guess, my big point. And this is mainly developed in the Sunni world, so I'm mainly talking about Sunni thought. No matter what we call it, in effect, to my mind, there has been a separation of politics and religion. So religion becomes the supporting act, as it were, but not the main or the co-equal element. So I guess, and this is something for us to talk about. So Dr. Farooq mentioned Deen wa Dawla as one of the central concepts. I'd like us to question that to some extent. I'd like us to question it. So this is not to say that religion, morality is unimportant. It is. But it's not to say that they're one and the same, and not to say that the state must be religious. So that's generally the big point that I want to make. So if we move on, I just want to, that phrase, history confirming faith, I'd just like you to think about that for a moment. This is a wonderful phrase of someone that I suppose we would characterize as an Orientalist. This was Wilfred Cantwell Smith, one of the great thinkers on comparative religion, who had this wonderful phrase that said that in Islam, history confirms faith. In other words, that there isn't a dissonance, there isn't a contradiction between history and what the faith prescribes. So clearly, there's going to be this kind of, in the moral imaginary of Muslims, there's going to be a strong emphasis on the need for history and faith to be somehow aligned. So when we look at, therefore, the faith, what do we see? That there are over 40 references in the Quran to obeying authority, whether that's God, His Prophet, or those in authority among you. But again, we have to look at this with a kind of a historical eye as well as a sort of a believer's approach, and to accept that Muhammad's authority, the authority of the Prophet Muhammad, was something which developed and evolved over time. So that his authority was challenged at times. It wasn't as unchallenged as some say. And it had connections with prior existing society. So we have to remember that we're talking about societies which are essentially tribal in 7th century Arabia. So in a sense, the notion of the tribal sheikh, the one who would be responsible for arbitration, for dealing with resolving disputes, this would be an ingrained political concept. Why would it not apply to the Prophet? And I believe that it did. But of course, there was more to that, and there's that normative element. So the Prophet's authority increased insofar as he could be an effective sheikh in the sense of arbitration, leadership. But there was also the religious dimension, the normative dimension. He was Rasulullah. And that, of course, in a way, is a game changer. So it's both. It's both. It's both the elements of the normative elements and a kind of a development of a prophetic authority that emerges from the historical context and society of his time. So moving along, we know that one of the key ideas here, and you know this yourselves, is that the Constitution of Medina is meant to be the paradigmatic political order. And this is such an interesting document for us because, and you know, we can talk about this, by the way, there's endless historical debate about it. You know, it's clearly not one document. It's clearly several documents that put together. It's probably more like a series of treaties than a constitution, but it's still nevertheless an important document. And it's interesting that just about everybody, wherever you are on today's political spectrum, whether you're at the very radical, conservative, radical end or at the very liberal end of it, just about everybody would say invests in the Constitution of Medina this paradigmatic quality. It's a model. It's a model for political order. And in some ways, it created a model not only for politics, but for a kind of cosmopolitanism. So the faith in one God was meant to displace the kinship that would have existed just in that pre-Islamic Arabia, etc. And we have the idea, we're going to talk about the Ummah more tomorrow, but the Muhajirun and the Ansar would constitute one Ummah, etc. But what about the others? And at one point, one of the stipulations of the Constitution of Medina says it is to the exclusion of other people. And as you'll see in that final point, you know, endless debate about are the Jews to be accepted. So here's a short version, yes, no. Yes, they are, and to be tolerated and protected, but not exactly equal, because obviously they have a different deen, etc. So it does appear that we do have some documentary evidence that would give us some guidance, which I guess you could put it this way, was a codification or a sort of structuring of institutionalizing of the rights and duties of a ruler and the ruled in 7th century Arabia. I think we can say that. Should it be therefore seen as the first constitution in the world, as Muhammad Hamidullah says, that's too much. That's going too far, giving it too much credit. But it's certainly there as exemplary. And I guess what I want to suggest here is that although that might be seen as a kind of foundational document, everything is to play for now. Everything is to play for. In the succeeding centuries, Muslim thinkers will say, yeah, but we don't have 7th century Arabia. We don't have Medina. We don't have the Prophet. Now what do we do? And so it becomes a big question, it becomes the big problem of political order. So what happens then is that very soon two fundamental changes occur. Islam spreads, its geographical spread. It had immense success and very quickly. And then leadership, as you know, gets transformed from kind of religio-political authority to dynastic rule. So political order becomes quickly, to my mind, becomes quickly bound up with implicit notions of empire and narrowly based rule. So putting it much more bluntly than perhaps I should, concepts of political order now become secular, in effect. And in Sunni circles, we have, of course, the whole debate about the Khilafah. So if I can move on to the high theory, sorry, I don't have one here in front of me of this. Yeah, how then do we account for the leadership if we've got this very expanded Muslim world, and we also have dynasties rather than the kind of succession that we think should be there morally approved? Well, I just want to point out, and this is very quickly, and I think some of the readings go over this. In a way, we've had sort of, so again, this is what happens after the Constitution of Medina. What are Muslim thinkers thinking about what is political order? Roughly speaking, I say you can divide it into two roughly ways of looking at this: philosophical schools and institutional schools. Right? The philosophical approach puts this emphasis on a very idealized version of leadership, and in a sense, this is Al-Farabi, Al-Madina Al-Fadila. So this is the virtuous city. So what is this? This is Plato. This is Plato's Republic. So Plato's Republic is here, and the central idea is that you can blend rationality with the ethics. You go on to Ibn Sina in his Shifa. He argues for, and again, sort of it's certainly neo-Platonic, if it's not Platonic. The idea of the philosopher king, here it's the philosopher prophet. So, in other words, a very idealized philosophical version of political order. What do we do after the prophet? What do we do after the Constitution of Medina? We have a philosopher king. Well, good luck with that. Obviously, it's not going to happen. You get to Ibn Rushd, and it's Aristotelian. Ibn Rushd says, in a sense, we do need philosophers. They guide us. They're the ones who are going to take care of the law, and the law can be both civil and it can be the Sharia, the religious, etc. So, in a sense, we have a clear set of thinkers who would articulate a pretty idealized, abstract version of political order. Then you have the more pragmatic approach. Now, the more pragmatic approach is basically about the debate about the caliphate. And some of you will know of this. I'm sure maybe all of you will know of it. The institution of the caliphate emerges. Let me just step back for a second. It's not on the PowerPoint, but let me just fix this for you in the historical terms. So we're talking from the Umayyads now into the Abbasids, right? So essentially what's happening is that a central authority is concretizing, is becoming solidified, is becoming in a way important. That occurs in the Umayyad period, but of course a lot of it occurs in the early Abbasid period. But here is also showing the multiculturalism of Islam. What happens in the first 50 years, the first 100 years of the Abbasid Empire? Persianization of political ideas. Ideas come in from Persia. The idea of the administrative structures, what we would say the viziers, wazir, ministers, bureaucrats, administrative offices, These all come into play roughly in the first century of the Abbasids, even the first 50 years of the Abbasid period. So by the time we get to the early Abbasids, we've got a defined political institution, the caliphate. But here's the killer. Just as the moment we get this, it starts to fall apart. It doesn't last very long. It may last in name, but it doesn't last in terms of power. And so the collapse of it is now what this person, Mawardi, is worried about. So Marwadi in the 11th century puts forward his famous discussion of the caliphate, Al-Ahkam as-Sultaniyya, very famous book. This is the classical definition of what the caliphate is. Yeah, and you can read this, and I can hand it out later so you can read it in detail. But basically, what he does is he's trying to say, yep, the caliphate can be based on certain scriptural reference points, but it's really something we need. You need a political institution. But essentially, at the end of the day, what was this really about? It was really a polemic. It was an exposition of a maximalist version of political authority precisely at the moment that it was weak. Why do you have to put forward such a defense of the caliphate? Because it was collapsing. And so we now have this almost exaggerated statement that political order depends on this. And you can see here that it's also a reaction to the Mutasilites. It's a reaction to the historical picture is that why is it falling apart? It's falling apart because there's an intrusion from the east, the Buyids or the Buwayhids. They bring in Ithna Ashari Shi'ism. So we now have a confrontation, the great Sunni empire, but yet being confronted by the Shia from the east. We have the caliphate in name being God's deputy, or the prophet's deputy, and then we have the reality that there's no power, etc. So Marwadi is trying to respond to all of this, and he's trying to make an argument. But I think you think you're getting my point, that by this point it's really basically a secular institution, and that for all intents and purposes it doesn't work. This is a last-ditch attempt to sort of, in a way, justify its legitimacy. But the legitimacy kind of comes down to what we might call pragmatic, institutional, rather than moral, rather than religious. So here comes our favorite guy, Ibn Taymiyyah. So Ibn Taymiyyah, who we can put anywhere on the political spectrum you want. Dr. Farouk and I were talking about him. You know, he's the arch radical. You could even say he's a liberal sometimes. So where do you put Ibn Taymiyyah? I'd say he's a realist. So Ibn Taymiyyah is basically talking about, okay, what works? What works here? You know what we have to do? We have to avoid fitna. How do we avoid fitna? We have to have strong leadership. We have to have somebody holding against the intrusions of chaos and the impious. So there is a religious obligation built into it, but it's really the defense of a kind of a social and political order. And that when this occurs, the action of the caliph will be for the common interest. So this concept of interest is going to become more and more important. You know, maslaha. It's going to become more and more important as a political idea. So political authority, it is the religiously right thing to do what is in the interests of the people. But it's also the politically smart thing to do, is to do what is in the interests of the people. So this quote that I've got here, governing the affairs of the people is the greatest obligation of religion. Indeed, religion cannot be established except by it. So different sultanates can do it. You don't necessarily need the caliph in Baghdad. Different sultanates can do it. What you do is you need the political order, leaders must uphold the religious obligations, but at the same time, religion can't survive unless it has political order. So the emphasis kind of falls on the need for political order, the need for stability of government. Pragmatism. That's, I think, comes clear. So we add to this the social cohesion argument. And this again is sort of how we might think of it in broader terms. And this is Ibn Khaldun, obviously, that he basically argued that politics has got to be connected somehow to society, obviously. And in a way, the most effective politics is going to be the one where there's social cohesion behind it. There's social support behind it. You're not going to survive as a political leader if there isn't some sort of there isn't the will of the people behind you in a way. So of course he acknowledged that there should be a form of Islamic-based governance, siyasa shari'iyya, and this is what Ibn Taymiyyah said. But he also said that alternation of power can occur. So what matters is group solidarity. This is the famous concept of asabiyya. The rise and fall of dynastic regimes occurs, and so religious law at times it may seem that it's a problem, but it cannot be at odds with this practical exigency of strong leadership, or more broadly, public interest. In other words, there's not going to be, for Ibn Khaldun, there's not going to be any kind of contradiction between the asabiyya, the solidarity of society, and the legitimacy of the political ruler. So they have to be connected. So what do we get from Ibn Taymiyyah? We get from Ibn Taymiyyah that you need politics to defend religion. But you don't need politics necessarily to be the same as religion. What do we get from Ibn Khaldun? Politics and religion require some sort of social solidarity behind it. So it's kind of putting things like almost in modern terms that we would find maybe very resonant, that no politics is going to survive unless it has roots. And this is, I think, what Khaldun was saying. So modern thinking on this subject. Obviously, the biggest influence has been the overwhelming influence of Western imperialism, and then this steady decline of this symbolic institution, the caliphate, finally abolished in 1924. So you get, and I'm sure very familiar with all these names. You'll get Rashid Rida and various other people who will argue, well, what are we going to do now that the caliphate was abolished by the Kemalist regime in 1924? What do we do now? And there's an endless debate about what's the answer. Rashid Rida, in a way, was suggesting that what we need to do is go back to the past and basically reinstitute it in some way. In other words, the kind of reintroduction of a traditional caliphate, that it was necessary, etc., and that if anything, and even not only should we reinstitute it, but everybody else, Ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn Khaldun, in many ways opened up Islam in some ways and said, why does it have to be always Arab-centered? Others can do it too. But now we get to Rida, and Rida is sort of saying, yeah, it's got to be Arab. So we go back to the reaffirmation of the centrality of it, but obviously others are going to debate it. And probably the clearest example of that is Ali Abdul Razak, who in 1925. So remember, this is a direct response to the abolition of 1924. Remember, Ali Abdul Razak was an alim. He was a sheikh of Al-Azhar. So he writes his famous book, Al-Islam wal-Usul al-Hukm. Very famous book. So what are the roots of government? What are the roots of governance, etc.? And he said that one must distinguish between the spiritual and the temporal, and that the Prophet established neither a kingdom nor a state. Very interesting. And that, unfortunately, the claims and privileges of people like the ulama, etc., kind of flow from a partisan identification with some form of Islamic order, political order. So he began to disagree with it, and he said that history is replete with examples of bad rulers who said that they were good religious leaders, good Islamic leaders. So he was totally dismissive. The history is on my side. The history is telling me that one bad ruler after the other suggests that this is not the way to go. And also he then endorsed the Khaldunian view that the caliphate was a worldly institution, so it could decline. It could go. It could be abolished. Why do you need it? Which, of course, you can imagine the resonance of that in the current debate about ISIS, etc. So on the discussion about the Islam and the secular state, a big topic, which I hope we might be able to discuss later, I just want to say that, you would think that this is a really simple topic. Islam, secularism, never the two shall meet. Never the twain shall meet. They're antithetic to each other, totally contradicting each other, etc. Well, as I've tried to suggest, you may disagree, I've tried to suggest that I think Islamic history, intellectual history, suggests that it's been secularized in fact, whether it's the ideal or not, it's been secularized in fact. But those who argue against it, against secularism, are still there, and are making the point. And I just gave you two examples. I only give you these two because some of you may follow. My students tell me that this is all over Twitter, these sort of debates. I clearly don't even have a clue what WhatsApp is. So I clearly don't know what's going on Twitter. So I just live through my students here. But Salman Auda and Safar Hawali are two famous Saudi sheikhs. Yeah. So they've taken it upon themselves in the last few years to fight the fight. Secularism is bad. Secularism and Islamic. Why? Because it's Jahiliyyah. And if you say the Christian conceptualization, to render unto God what is God's and unto Caesar what is Caesar's, then you have denied the sovereignty of Allah. And this is a very particular repudiation of Ali Abdul Razak, who they have repudiated by name. So again, get the point that I'm trying to make. Here's a venerable sheikh of Al-Azhar, now being repudiated by a Saudi sheikh. And here's what they say. They say Muslims cannot say prayers at the mosque and leave religion on the way out. In other words, religion should carry through all your life, including politics. So there's a clear debate. And sort of ending on this part of the discussion, the Islamic State, obviously a topic of immense interest now, etc. So I guess I've been maybe I've used the word state, and I've noticed that in some of the readings people do use the word state. But I'd like to kind of historicize it. To my mind, a dawla al-Islamiyya is a modern concept. Find it in the Quran for me. Find it in Ibn Sina. Find it in Farabi. Find it in Taymiyyah. Find it in Khaldun. It doesn't, I don't think it exists. It's a modern idea. And it's a modern idea which is tied to the in effect, what do we do that since we no longer have the caliphate? So we must replace it with something. So it's become an idea of interest, but nobody knows what it means. So we have a minimalist definition, and the minimalist definition is it's the institution which is charged with the defense of the law, defense of the Sharia. But what's the Sharia? How much? Whose interpretation? What school of thought of the Sharia? So these three assumptions seem to me pretty much undercutting the idea of the Islamic State there, but to my mind, we ought to be thinking of questioning them. One is din wa dawla. One is the state must be obeyed as the Islamic authority, and that the state is the guarantor of morality. The state is the guarantor of hisbah. And again, we can go off on this, but hisbah is, of course, a term which has been reinterpreted in the modern period. It's a medieval idea which has been completely reinterpreted. So, and just final point on this is that we have those who say separation is not only possible, who would disagree with what these Saudi sheikhs say, but they say that it's even necessary. And this may follow in a kind of a liberal tradition, a tradition with people like Tatawi, Afghani, Kawakabi, Abdu, etc. This is what Albert Harani called the liberal age of Muslim thinking. I probably don't need you to Nukholesh Majid, of course, advocated the idea of Islamic secularization, the desacralization of parts of knowledge and areas of life, etc. And of course, in our period, we've got people who've gone really far in arguing this. Abdullahi Naim, you probably know of him. If Muslims are to remain Muslims, the state must remain secular. It's a really interesting argument. When the state thinks it's Islamic, it's taking Muslims away from Islam. It's quite interesting argument. And then I just remind you that there is a St. Petersburg Declaration. The St. Petersburg Declaration says, we are secular Muslims and secular persons of Muslim societies. We are believers, doubters, and unbelievers brought together by a great struggle, not between the West and Islam, but between the free and the unfree. We say to Muslim believers, there is a noble future for Islam as a personal faith, not a political doctrine. So it's a really interesting argument. So to summarize this bit, and I'll do the second one much more quickly, it seems to me the three dominant traditions have emerged over time, right? The first is that Islam prescribes a particular political order. The caliphate, or something called the Islamic State. Abu Allah Maududi, for example, said that the practice of Islam is meaningless if you don't have a political system that's called Islam. So that's one. Second school of thought, Islam provides moral guidance to politics, but it doesn't create a political order of its own. So even if someone's like Abul Hassan Ali Nadwi says, I'm apolitical, he's political in the sense that he argues that politics is meaningless if rulers and the ruled don't have it in their heart, don't have Islam in their heart. So this school of thought would say you don't need a political order, you don't need a political system. What you need is right-thinking Muslims. You need it in the heart, not in the political institutions. And the third says that Islam, just like all religions, is intrusive and authoritarian. And so it's nothing more than a personal faith. And therefore, politics must be secular if freedom is to prevail. So we'll talk about it more, and I want to move on to the second one, and I'll do it more quickly, and is to say that I guess the challenge for all of us, for everybody thinking about this subject, is what's the mix between religion and politics? What's the mix? And I think I've been trying to suggest to you there are some who have articulated the problems. But I've also argued that I think the history shows there have been sort of a separation. But it doesn't mean irreligion. It doesn't mean anti-religion. It just means what place should it have? What place should morality, religion have? Not necessarily that it needs to be incorporated into the very structure of the political system. So that's the debate of the day. So the second issue I want to talk about is renewal and reform. And here, this is so obvious in a way, but I just wanted to point out that it's so interconnected with what we've just been talking about. Many of the themes I've just been saying are almost the same themes about renewal. So tajdeed, islah. Okay, so why should I tell you anything about this? You know the basic point. The Prophet was a renewer. The Prophet came to reform. So he changed Meccan society, changed the Arabian society, etc. So it's ingrained. It goes from the very beginning. And, you know, we have the famous Hadith, Allah will raise for this ummah at the beginning of every century, etc., a renewal, etc. So, of course, it becomes who's the renewer? What are you renewing? How are you renewing? So I guess my three questions. Does renewal inevitably mean reform? Do you have to change it? What reform is acceptable? Or putting it differently, what is bid'ah? What's bid'ah today? And how are renewal and reform to be carried out? Now, the reason I mention that is because, of course, you will know that all the Islamist movements would say, essentially today, that they are carrying out a form of renewal and reform. So these ingrained notions is more or less what I just said. I just remind you that Shafi himself was an early mujaddid, and a renewer, etc. You can, and if you move on to the next one, you can just see the others as well. So, you know, if you want the names of them, there they are. There are some of them. You know, these are all people that maybe by consensus, we would accept that they have been renewers over time. They've important. So when we get more to the, say, the late medieval, early modern period, somebody like Sir Hindi in India said at the beginning of the second said, you know what we need? We need an infusion of piety rather than this outward Sharia. The famous historian of Islam, whose name I just forgot, Marshall Hudson, talked about Sharia-mindedness. Sir Hindi would say, it's not really Sharia-mindedness, it's piety, taqwa. That's what's important. Not Sharia-mindedness, not the externalization of religion, the internalization of it. So, in other words, he's bringing a kind of a Sufi dimension to renewal. So Sayyid Ahmed Khan, some of you will know, again in India, the kind of modern, the bridging of kind of Western and Islamic education. And look at his famous statement, which is kind of interesting. The work of God is identical to the word of God. It's a good phrase. It's an interesting phrase. Something to think about, whether or not there may be sort of understated the difficulties of interpreting the word, but there we go. I just want to point out that one of the larger arguments here has to do with objectives. So this is maqasid, obviously. And here we actually can see if not a liberal Farouk, Ibn Taymiyyah, we can see a kind of permissive Ibn Taymiyyah here, who kind of opened up the idea of the maqasid. So, the maqasid of the objectives, which are supposed to give rise to legal principles, the legal principles, basically, right? So, etc. But he said that they should be much broader. The objectives of what we're doing should be much broader. And they should be things that, again, are more like, how do you keep a functioning political order? How do you keep a functioning society going? Therefore, a basic objective, a part of the maqasid, should be things like upholding, fulfilling contracts. So in so doing, though, he broadens the range, and this is going to be very quickly related to the whole idea of public interest. That if you can delineate what are the objectives of the Sharia or Islamic law, or of Islam broadly, you can identify what is in the public interest. And I think you know that the concept of maslahah, or public interest, will become a central concept in modern liberal thinking. Political rulers should rule in the public interest, not for themselves. So the classic idea then here is in the medieval period, huge debate. Then how do you determine what is in the public interest? And one answer is you do it on the basis of the maqasid. But basically, how do you interpret them? And I don't know whether you've come across Shatabi, but I would highly urge you to look at his work, Ibrahim Shatabi, so 14th century. This is a guy that has become quite a favorite of modern liberal thinkers. This is a legal jurist who argues that you basically have to look at the ethical dimensions of the law. And that what are those? We should have a safe life, kind of a secure life, a non-corrupt life, and in that way we have a moral life. But we're doing this because this is what society needs, etc. So divinely revealed laws have all been established to preserve human beings' interests, both in this life and the life to come. So, a general point here, this is a point of interpretation, and again, a technical point. Shatabi's legal philosophy is generally thought to be inductive. All right, so you argue from the basis of what you see and build up to a legal principle, rather than taking the statement of God said and then deducing from that. You argue the other way around. So nowhere in the Quran does it say that the Sharia is for the welfare of the people. But Shatabi said, but let's look at the totality of Islamic thinking. And it's absolutely clear that this is what it's all about. It's all about the public interest. It's all about maslahah. So we have, you can look at this later. These are just examples of the various revivalist movements. But what I wanted to argue is that in the modern period, this impulse, which goes right from the beginning, goes right from the Prophet himself, Tajdeed and Islah, right from the Prophet. But in our period, has become ideologized. We should have a movement that does this. So you identify that basically Islam has gone off the straight path. And the best example of the movement is the Muslim Brotherhood and Hassan al-Banna. And this is the whole idea of the harakah, or the movement, etc. And these things that are 1 through 8, I just list them simply to show you the way that Banna said you need a revivalist movement. A revivalist movement does all of those things. A revivalist movement does dawah, it does education, it's a social group, it's an athletic organization, it does all of those things. It's a political organization, etc. But key point here, yeah, society's gone off the track. So what do? We form a movement to fix it. So in other words, it becomes more a political organization is the answer. And I just give you one more example. I'm sure you're familiar with Maududi. So Maududi, I've referred to him, there's the South Asian thinker, etc. So what did he say? He said that basically, why do we need to reform all of this? Because we've just gone off the straight path, the Sirat al-Mustaqim. We've done it. Why? Servitude of worldly urges, blind following, obedience to others other than Allah. So Jahiliyyah is the term, of course, which he used and then adopted by Sayyid Qutb later to apply to the present period, when, of course, as you know, it's meant to be a pre-Islamic concept. Islam was come to stop the Jahiliyyah, etc. Every such conduct which goes against Islamic cultures. So he says that actually since the time after the rightly guided caliphs, there's never been anything but a mixture of Jahiliyyah and Islam. It's pretty strong. It's pretty strong criticism of the entire Islamic history. And then finally, it will be impossible to succeed. So this is my point about the inherent political side of it. It's impossible to succeed if you want to stop by means of sermons the evils of drinking, gambling, usury, bribery, obscene shows, etc., etc. Of course, with the force of government, these things can be exterminated. So I guess my larger point is this, is that throughout Islamic history, we have found many examples of renewal and reform, but it was meant for moral instruction. In the present period, it's become harder, much more politicized. It's all bad, and the only way we're going to do it is to do a forceful politics, a movement, an Islamic government, an Islamic state. So those tendencies have come back to roost in so many ways. So the next one just talks about Sayyid Qutb, and it more or less you can follow it, just simply tying the Jahiliyyah idea to Hakamiyya, or the sovereignty of God. In other words, if we don't do these things, according to Sayyid Qutb, then we're violating God's sovereignty. But here I have to tell you, and I think at least Hasnan has heard this from me before, I think that the concept of Hakamiyya is another modern invention. Ascribing the concept of sovereignty to the God is modern terminology. The Quran says mulk. So the idea that we've turned it into in a sense, the secular idea of sovereignty is interesting. So the next couple of ones you can follow. I just want to give you one, maybe skip to the next one. Yeah, I just want to show you the lively debate that goes on about this. So to have renewers is a good thing, is it not? Does not the Hadith say that at the beginning of every sort of epic we're going to have a renewal, a mujaddid? Absolutely. What happens if the mujaddid is a guy called Ibrahim al-Baghdadi, who is giving a khutbah in Mosul? Is he a renewer? So the Saudi ulama have had to deal with this issue. And the Saudi ulama have said, yeah, no, he's not a renewer. So we have now this sort of debate, sort of a small debate going on about, so are these guys renewers, etc. And so the Saudi ulama say things like, but the Wahhabis are real renewals. They are the, Ibn Abdul Wahhab, and he was in his own, in a conservative way. So was a renewer of Islam. That's what was it about? But we're not. But they have to tread very carefully, because the hadith I suggested at the beginning, the one recorded by Abu Daud and others, is sahih. It's good. It has good provenance. So you're not able to say, we're not going to have a renewal and at the beginning of every epic. You can't say that. So the Saudi ulama have had to walk a very fine line here. So it has the potential for abuse, etc. So they would argue at the end of the day, what you need is proper authority. So let me sort of, can I conclude? We find ourselves in a period where, I'm now talking about the reform part of all this, that why doesn't Islam have an Islamic reformation? If there only was a real reformation in Islam, then we wouldn't have all these problems, etc. So you've heard that. This is quite a common argument that's made. I think it's become almost an orientalist trope. So it's clearly culturally condescending. Why can't you become like the progressive West? So it's clearly condescending, etc. But I guess the bigger point I wanted to make is it misses that Islam has reformed, has been reforming all the time throughout the centuries. So despite these pious fictions that there's an unchanging theology and that there's kind of normative univocality, there have been very diverse lines of thought, as I've tried to suggest, and that these have related to these themes of authority and reform. So having said that there are all these diversity of thought, I want to say that to me there seems to be 4 things I want to leave you with to think about. So this is my vast and quick romp through 14 centuries here, and it is that it seems to me that over time there's been a lively interaction of theology and history, norms and practice, principles and pragmatism. It's been a constant dialectic that's been going on all throughout Islamic history. Secondly, traditions in the broad sense are important. Why? Because they link believers to their past and they link believers to their future. So traditions are important. So they function as a kind of collective memory. But thirdly, they can be interpreted differently. And that although they are differently interpreted from time to time, they can still remain consistent with a basic moral imaginary. I was looking recently at another Orientalist, I hate to admit, Montgomery Watt, who said that there is an Islamic Weltanschauung. There's an Islamic worldview. There's an Islamic ethos. There is. Marshall Hodgson called it Islamic Kate, to get away from the idea that it was doctrinally defined. But there is something that I might call the moral imaginary, even if there are different interpretations to traditions. And yet, as we'll see throughout the next couple of days, there is direct and politicized contestation over the interpretations. So these debates go on, the liberals versus the conservatives, the Islamists versus the apolitical Salafis, you name them. These debates are going to go on and on. And to me, that is endemic into what we've got, and it's a great and unavoidable challenge of our time. So that's what I have to say, and I hope we have some comments and questions.